The rain in Alexandria, Virginia, didn't fall, it drummed. It beat against the bedroom window like the distant, rhythmic thud of rotor blades chopping through the dense Afghan air. Helen Parker bolted upright, her lungs desperate for oxygen, her hands instinctively grabbing for a combat rifle that hadn't been there in 3 years. Her sheets were drenched in cold sweat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She squeezed her eyes shut, counting backward from 10, forcing the smells of cordite, burning diesel, and copper blood to fade back into the darkest corners of her mind. 1, 2, 3. She was not in the Korengal Valley. She was in her suburban townhouse. 4, 5, 6. She was not Captain Helen Parker. Special Activities Division, the ghost who retrieved data from the bodies of fallen operatives. She was just Helen. Mom. Slowly, the tremors in her hands subsided. Helen pushed the tangled sheets aside and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her feet hit the cold hardwood floor, grounding her. She walked quietly down the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking a familiar, comforting tune. She stopped at the door cracked slightly ajar and peered inside. A small nightlight cast a soft, pink glow across the room. There, buried under a mountain of stuffed animals and a starry quilt, was Chloe, 8 years old, breathing softly, entirely oblivious to the wars her mother fought every single night behind closed eyelids. Helen leaned against the doorframe, a bittersweet ache blooming in her chest. Chloe was the anchor when the PTSD threatened to pull Helen into the abyss. The thought of Chloe's bright green eyes and her gap-toothed smile was the tether that pulled her back to the surface. Helen had survived ambushes, interrogations, and the brutal loss of her entire unit. But the hardest battle she had ever fought was the one inside her own head, trying to be whole enough, sane enough, for this little girl. "I've got you, Bug," Helen whispered into the quiet room. "Mommy's right here." A few hours later, the gloomy morning gave way to the chaotic routine of single motherhood. Burnt toast, spilled orange juice, and the frantic search for a missing left sneaker. "Mom, if I miss the bus again, Mrs. Gable is going to give me the evil eye," Chloe yelled from the bottom of the stairs, her backpack slung haphazardly over one shoulder. "She's a third-grade teacher." "Chloe, not a Sith Lord," Helen called back, bounding down the stairs with the missing blue sneaker in hand. She knelt, sliding it onto her daughter's foot and tying the laces with practiced speed. She looked up, brushing a stray lock of honey blonde hair out of Chloe's eyes. "Listen to me, have a good day, be kind, and what's our rule?" Chloe rolled her eyes playfully, though a smile tugged at her lips. "Stay aware of my surroundings. Never follow a secondary location. And text you if plans change." "That's my girl." Helen kissed her forehead, the smell of strawberry shampoo momentarily washing away the lingering phantom sense of her nightmares. "I love you. I'll pick you up at 3. Watching the yellow school bus pull away, the forced smile on Helen's face slowly dissolved. The armor of the cheerful mother slipped away, revealing the exhausted, fractured soldier beneath. It was Tuesday. Tuesday meant a visit to the one place she dreaded and craved in equal measure. Therapy. Dr. Julian Vance's office was located in a high-end medical plaza in Georgetown. It was a sanctuary of neutral tones, plush leather, and the faint, calming scent of lavender and cedar. It was designed to disarm, to make you feel safe. For the past 6 months, Dr. Vance had been her lifeline. He was a pioneer in treating severe, combat-induced trauma through advanced hypnotherapy and EMDR. He was in his late 50s. With kind, crinkling eyes, silver hair neatly swept back, and a voice that sounded like smooth, warm scotch. He never pushed too hard. He just listened. "You look tired today, Helen," Dr. Vance said, adjusting his glasses as she sank into the deep, oversized recliner in the center of the room. He sat opposite her, a legal pad resting on his knee. "The valley again," Helen muttered, staring at the pendulum clock ticking rhythmically on his mahogany desk. Tick, tock, tick, tock. "I thought the nightmares were fading, Julian, but last night, it was vivid. I could feel the heat. I could hear the radio static." Vance nodded slowly, his expression a perfect portrait of professional empathy. "Trauma is a tide, Helen. It ebbs and flows. You've made incredible progress. Don't let one rough night discount 6 months of healing. Are you ready to do the work today?" Helen took a deep breath, clutching the armrests. She hated the vulnerability of it, the surrender of control, but she wanted to be better. For Chloe, "I'm ready." "Good. Lie back. Close your eyes." His voice dropped an octave, becoming a resonant, hypnotic hum. "Focus on your breathing, deep in through the nose. Hold it, release through the mouth." Helen followed his instructions. The ambient noise of the city outside faded. "You are walking down a long, white hallway," Dr. Vance murmured. "The lights are soft. At the end of the hallway is a heavy oak door. That is the door to the valley. We are going to lock it today. Helen, we are going to lock it. And you are going to give me the key." She felt the familiar, heavy blanket of the trance washing over her. Her limbs turned to lead. Her conscious mind detached, floating above her body like an observer. She was in the white hallway. She saw the oak door. "I'm at the door," she whispered, her physical voice slurred, heavy with relaxation. "Excellent," Vance said. "Lock it." Hear the click. In her mind, she turned the deadbolt. Click. "Now, Helen." Vance's voice shifted. The warm, comforting scotch took on a metallic, icy edge. "Turn around. There is another door in the hallway. A heavy, steel door. It's painted black. Do you see it?" In her trance, Helen hesitated. A spike of anxiety pierced through the heavy blanket of hypnosis. She hadn't built a black door. Her therapy was about the valley. About the war. I see it," she breathed, her brow furrowing in the waking world. "Walk to the black door, Helen." Vance's voice was closer now. He had moved from his chair. She could feel his presence leaning over her. "This is a safe space. But behind that door is a burden you're carrying. A burden you brought back from the Geneva summit before the valley." "Do you remember Geneva?" A sudden, sharp alarm went off in the deepest, most primal part of Helen's brain. The survival instinct that had kept her alive in hostile territories roared to life. Geneva. She had never mentioned Geneva to Dr. Vance. Geneva wasn't part of her trauma. Geneva was classified, top secret, level 5 clearance. Geneva was where her team had intercepted a Russian cryptographic key, a sequence of numbers that could dismantle the United States eastern seaboard power grid. It was an operation wiped from the books. She hadn't even written it down in her private journals. It's dark," Helen stammered, maintaining the slurred speech of the deeply hypnotized. Her heart rate began to climb, but years of biofeedback training allowed her to keep her breathing slow, even, and deceptive. "Open the black door, Helen," Vance commanded softly. The empathy was completely gone from his tone. It was a surgical, Cold command. You see the file on the table. You see the numbers. The sequence from Operation Manticore. Read the numbers to me. Helen, let the burden go. Operation Manticore. A chill, colder than any Afghan winter, raced down Helen's spine. Dr. Julian Vance wasn't a therapist. He wasn't helping her heal. He was a miner, and her mind was the quarry. For 6 months, he had been carefully, systematically breaking down her psychological defenses, using her PTSD as a Trojan horse to bypass her mental conditioning. He was an extractor, a spy, and he was standing inches from her, waiting to steal the keys to a national catastrophe directly from her subconscious. The frightened, broken veteran inside Helen evaporated, burned away by the white-hot clarity of adrenaline. The operator awoke. She needed to know who he worked for. She needed to know how much he already had. In her mind's eye, Helen turned her back on the black door. In the physical world, she let out a soft, shuddering sigh, feigning a tremor. I can't, she whimpered, deliberately letting her breathing turn erratic. The lock, it's broken. Julian, it's burning. The valley, the fire. She threw herself into a fake panic attack. Her body convulsed slightly. She gasped for air, her eyes snapping open, wide and filled with manufactured terror. Dr. Vance instantly recoiled, snapping back to his chair with the grace of a predator returning to the shadows. By the time Helen's vision focused on him, he was sitting back, his notepad on his knee, his face a mask of gentle concern. "Helen, you're safe," he said soothingly, leaning forward. "You're in my office. Breathe with me." The memory became too intense. "It's okay. We pushed too hard today." Helen sat up, wiping a bead of sweat from her temple. She looked at the man who had known her deepest fears, who had held her hand while she cried over lost friends. She looked at his crisp suit, his comforting smile, and the faint, almost imperceptible look of frustration hidden deep in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she gasped out, wrapping her arms around herself. I saw the fire again. I couldn't get past it." "It's perfectly fine, Helen. We will try again next week. Rest. Drink some water." She stood up, her legs intentionally wobbly. She gathered her purse, nodding gratefully at him. "Thank you, Dr. Vance. I don't know what I'd do without you. I'm always here for you, Helen." She walked out of the plush, lavender-scented office and into the sterile hallway of the medical plaza. As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, the feigned weakness vanished from her posture. She stood up straight, her shoulders squaring. Her mind was racing, calculating variables, assessing threats. If they had sent an extractor like Vance, it meant they knew she was the last living operative who had memorized the Manticore sequence. It meant her cover was blown. It meant her home was likely compromised. It meant Chloe was in danger. Helen reached into her purse, her fingers bypassing her car keys and wrapping around the cold, textured grip of the tactical folding knife she always carried but hoped never to use again. The therapy was over. The war had just followed her home. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing Helen inside the stainless steel box. The moment the digital floor indicator began to tick downward, the facade of the fragile, traumatized veteran shattered completely. She leaned against the cold metal wall, closed her eyes, and took one sharp, stabilizing breath. 3 years. 3 years of PTA meetings, grocery runs, and bedtime stories. 3 years of trying to convince herself that the ghosts were dead. But the ghosts weren't dead. They had just learned to wear tailored suits and speak in soothing tones. Julian Vance, or whoever the hell he really was. Her mind catalogued the variables with frightening speed. If Vance was a hostile asset, he wouldn't be working alone. A high-value extraction like Operation Manticore required a team, surveillance, containment, and cleanup. Her house was compromised. Her car was definitely bugged. Her phone was a tracking beacon in her pocket. The elevator chimed at the lobby level. Helen opened her eyes. They were no longer the exhausted, haunted eyes of a struggling mother. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a predator. She stepped out into the bustling Georgetown Medical Plaza. The midday sun was blinding after the dim lights of Vance's office. She didn't look around, that was rookie behavior. Instead, she used the reflections in the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of a nearby cafe to scan the street. There, a charcoal gray Ford Explorer was parked illegally in a loading zone across the street. Its engine idling, windows heavily tinted. A man in a tailored trench coat was pretending to read the Washington Post on a bench near the corner. But he hadn't turned a page in 2 minutes. And a woman in jogging gear was stretching near the entrance of the plaza, her eyes tracking the doorway just a fraction too intensely. A 3-point surveillance net. They weren't just watching her, they were preparing to box her in. Vance must have realized her panic attack was a performance. The timeline had just accelerated from weeks to seconds. Helen kept her pace steady, her posture slightly hunched, still playing the victim. She walked past her parked Subaru Outback without a sideways glance. Getting in that car was a death sentence. Instead, she turned left, blending into a thick crowd of college students heading toward Wisconsin Avenue. She slipped her hand into her purse, her fingers finding her smartphone. Without breaking stride, she held the power button and the volume down key, triggering the factory reset. Then, as she passed an overflowing public trash can, she casually dropped the $1 device into a half-empty cup of iced coffee resting on top of the garbage. Signal lost. She rounded the corner and instantly broke into a dead sprint down a narrow, cobblestone alleyway. The 3 years of rust in her joints burned. But her muscle memory took over. She vaulted over a chain-link fence, landing softly on the balls of her feet in the rear lot of a boutique hotel. She needed to get to Alexandria. She needed to get to Chloe. It was 11:15 a.m. Chloe was in music class. Helen slipped through the hotel's service entrance, navigating the labyrinth of laundry carts and kitchen staff with practiced invisibility. She exited through the front lobby, grabbing a discarded tourist map and a pair of cheap sunglasses from a gift shop display, tossing a $20 bill on the counter without stopping. By the time she emerged onto the street on the opposite side of the block, she looked completely different. Her honey blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, the sunglasses hiding her face. The tourist map held open like a shield. She descended into the foggy bottom metro station, blending seamlessly into the subterranean rush. She didn't take a direct train. She rode the Blue Line 2 stops, hopped off right as the doors were closing, sprinted through the underground tunnel, and caught a Yellow Line train heading south toward Virginia. She watched the reflections in the train windows, tracking every face, every movement. The paranoia was a familiar, old friend. Stay aware of my surroundings. Never follow a secondary location. The rule she had taught Chloe echoed in her head. God, she prayed the little girl remembered it today. 30 minutes later, Helen burst out of the Braddock Road metro station in Alexandria, She didn't have a car. And a taxi was too traceable. She ran. She ran blocks through the quiet, tree-lined suburban streets, her lungs burning, her civilian clothes sticking to her sweat-drenched skin. When the red brick facade of Oak Creek Elementary came into view, Helen forced herself to stop behind a massive oak tree across the street. She was hyperventilating, but she couldn't afford to look crazy. She took 10 seconds to smooth her clothes, take down her hair, and regulate her breathing. She scanned the perimeter of the school. The yellow buses were parked. The playground was empty. Nothing looked out of place. But to an operative, normal was often the most terrifying camouflage. Helen crossed the street and walked into the main office. The smell of laminated paper and floor wax hit her, a stark contrast to the smell of danger she had been breathing for the last hour. Mrs. Parker, the elderly receptionist, Mrs. Higgins, looked up over her reading glasses. Surprised. "Can I help you? Chloe's lunch isn't for another hour." "Hi, Barbara," Helen said, her voice laced with a perfectly calibrated tone of breathless maternal panic. "I am so sorry. We have a family emergency. My father, he's in the hospital. I need to pull Chloe out of class right away. We have to get to Baltimore." Mrs. Higgins's face softened with instant sympathy. "Oh, my dear, I am so sorry. Of course, let me call Mr. Davis's room. You just sign her out right here." Helen grabbed the pen, her hand steady as a rock as she forged a messy, hurried signature on the sign-out sheet. Every second dragged like an hour. She kept her eyes locked on the front glass doors. "Come on, Bug, hurry." 2 minutes later, Chloe appeared in the office doorway, clutching her backpack, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Mom, what's wrong? Why are you here?" "Everything's going to be okay, sweetie," Helen said, closing the distance and taking Chloe's hand. Her grip was tight, too tight. Chloe looked up, sensing the invisible electricity radiating from her mother. "Have a safe trip, Mrs. Parker. Tell your father we're praying for him," Mrs. Higgins called out. "Thank you," Helen said, pushing the heavy glass doors open. They stepped out into the crisp autumn air. "Mom, you're hurting my hand," Chloe whispered, trying to pull away. "Chloe, listen to me very carefully," Helen said, her voice dropping to a low, serious whisper that she had never used with her daughter before. It was her command voice. "We are going to play a game. It's called Shadows. Do you remember how to play?" Chloe's eyes widened. They had played it in the house during thunderstorms when the power went out. It meant staying absolutely quiet and moving without being seen. "Yes." "Good. We are going to walk to the side gate. Do not look back at the street. Do not stop until I tell you." As they reached the edge of the school building, Helen risked one glance over her shoulder. A charcoal gray Ford Explorer had just pulled to a screeching halt in the exact spot Helen had been standing 5 minutes ago. 4 doors opened simultaneously. 4 men in dark clothing stepped out. They didn't look like parents. They looked like a tactical sweep team. Vance hadn't just sent watchers. He had sent a retrieval squad. And they had found them. "Run, Chloe," Helen hissed, shoving her daughter toward the narrow, wooded path behind the school. "Run now." The life they knew was over. The hunt had begun. The woods behind Oak Creek Elementary were a dense tangle of Virginia pine, thorny blackberry bushes, and damp earth. For the local kids, it was a place to build secret forts. For Helen Parker, it was a tactical playground. "Keep your head down, Chloe. Don't look back," Helen commanded, her voice a tight, Controlled hiss. She grabbed her daughter's hand, practically dragging the 8-year-old through the underbrush. Behind them, the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots hit the pavement of the school parking lot. Crunch. Snap. The sound of men entering the tree line. 4 of them, moving with the disciplined spacing of ex-military contractors. Vance hadn't hired local thugs, he had sent a professional kill team. "Mom, my backpack is caught," Chloe cried out, her voice trembling as a thick thorny branch snagged the bright pink nylon. "Leave it," Helen said without hesitation. She unclipped the chest strap and yanked Chloe forward, leaving the backpack hanging in the bushes like a brightly colored beacon. It was a calculated risk. The tracker Vance had inevitably slipped into her car or purse might not be the only one. If they had tagged Chloe's bag, leaving it behind would buy them exactly 90 seconds of misdirection. Helen veered sharply to the right, abandoning the muddy, beaten path the children usually took. She forced them into the thickest part of the brush, stepping carefully on exposed roots and rocks to avoid leaving footprints in the soft mud. "Mommy, my legs hurt. Who are those men?" Chloe was crying now, tears mixing with the sweat and dirt on her cheeks. "Are we playing shadows? I don't like this game." Helen's heart shattered, but she violently shoved the emotion down into the dark box in her mind where she kept the war. There was no room for a mother's tears right now. If she cried, they died. "I know, Bug, I know it hurts," Helen whispered, pulling Chloe behind the thick trunk of a rotting oak tree. She knelt down, gripping Chloe's shoulders firmly, forcing the little girl to look her in the eyes. "Listen to me, you are the bravest girl I know. But the game has changed. We have to be ghosts now. Ghosts don't make a sound. Understand?" Chloe swallowed hard, her little chin quivering, but she gave a jerky nod. "Good." Snap. The sound came from less than 50 yards away. The sweep team was fanning out. They had found the backpack. Target abandoned the bag, moving north. A deep, synthesized voice echoed faintly through the trees, communicating via tactical radio. "They think we're heading north toward the highway," Helen thought. "Perfect." Helen grabbed a heavy, dead branch from the ground and hurled it as hard as she could toward the north. Deeper into the thicket, it crashed through the dry leaves with a loud clatter. Instantly, she grabbed Chloe's hand and moved silently south, toward the rusty chain-link fence that separated the woods from an abandoned strip mall. They scaled the fence, Helen hoisting Chloe over and then vaulting it herself with a fluid grace she hadn't used in years. They hit the cracked asphalt of the alleyway and kept moving, keeping to the shadows of the dumpsters. 10 minutes later, they reached the Alexandria commuter lot. It was a sea of cars belonging to government workers who had taken the train into D.C. for the day. Helen navigated the rows with absolute precision until they reached the far corner. Beneath a flickering, broken streetlight, parked there, covered in a thick layer of yellow pollen and dust, was a 2012 Volvo station wagon. It looked like it had been abandoned for months. The registration tag was expired. It was entirely unremarkable. Helen didn't have a key. She crouched by the rear passenger tire, reached blindly up into the filthy wheel well, and her fingers brushed against a small, magnetized lockbox. She punched in a 4-digit code, Chloe's birth year, and the box popped open. A single, silver metal key fell into her palm. She unlocked the trunk and threw it open. "Get in the backseat, Chloe, and stay below the windows," Helen ordered. Chloe scrambled inside, curling into a tight ball on the floorboards. Helen pulled up the floor mat in the trunk, revealing the spare tire compartment. But there was no tire. Instead, bolted to the chassis, was a heavy-duty, waterproof Pelican case, the ghost box. She had built it 3 years ago, the day she was honorably discharged. Driven by the lingering paranoia of a woman who knew too many national secrets. She popped the latches. The smell of gun oil and fresh canvas hit the air. Inside were 2 identical black canvas go bags. Beside them lay thick stacks of bound $20 bills. 3 dark web purchased passports with different names but Helen's face. A cluster of untraceable burner phones. And a sleek, matte black Glock 19 with 3 fully loaded magazines. Helen grabbed the gun. The weight of it in her hand was a terrifyingly familiar comfort. The cold steel felt like an extension of her arm. She expertly checked the chamber. The metallic clack-clack echoing sharply in the quiet parking lot. She looked up. Chloe was peering over the backseat. Her wide, terrified green eyes locked onto the weapon. The innocence in the car was suddenly sucked out in a vacuum. "Mommy." Chloe's voice was barely a squeak. "Why do you have a gun?" Helen froze. This was the moment she had prayed would never come. The moment the veil dropped. She couldn't lie. Not anymore. "Because before you were born, Mommy had a very dangerous job." "Chloe," Helen said, her voice steady, though it cost her every ounce of strength she had. She slid the Glock into the waistband of her jeans at the small of her back, letting her loose sweater cover it. "I promised myself I would never do it again. But bad men are trying to hurt us. And I need this to make sure they can't." She grabbed the go bags and a burner phone. Slamming the trunk shut, she slid into the driver's seat, the leather cracking beneath her weight. The engine roared to life on the first try. She came here once a month in the dead of night just to turn it over and keep the battery alive. "Put your seatbelt on," Helen said, shifting the car into drive. As the dusty Volvo pulled out of the commuter lot and merged onto the highway, Helen powered on the burner phone. She didn't dial the police. The police couldn't help her against whoever employed Dr. Vance. They would only get in the way. Or worse, be bought off. She needed to go completely off the grid. And she needed to know exactly what was locked inside her own head. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 36 months. A number that didn't exist in any official directory. It rang twice before a gruff, gravelly voice answered. "The bakery is closed," the voice said. "This is Manticore," Helen said, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "And the oven is on fire. I need a ghost protocol. Marcus, now." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. "I'll be damned," Marcus finally replied. "I thought you were dead." "Parker." "I am," Helen said, merging into the fast lane, leaving her suburban life entirely in the rearview mirror. "But I'm about to haunt some people. Send me coordinates." The drive north toward Baltimore was a masterclass in paranoia. Helen didn't take the I-95. The interstate was a funnel, choked with traffic cameras and state troopers. Easy pickings for a digitized manhunt. Instead, she took the labyrinth of winding back roads, driving the dusty Volvo with the headlights off whenever they passed beneath the dense canopy of the Maryland woods. In the rearview mirror, the sky was bruising into a deep, violent purple. A cold autumn rain began to fall, smearing the windshield and turning the asphalt into a slick, black mirror. In the backseat, Chloe hadn't spoken a word in over an hour. She sat rigidly, clutching her knees to her chest, her eyes fixed on the rain tracing erratic paths across her window. The silence was heavier than any interrogation Helen had ever endured. "Chloe?" Helen said softly, keeping one eye on the winding road. "Are you hungry? There's a protein bar in the front pocket of the black bag." Chloe slowly shook her head, not breaking her gaze from the window. "I want to go home, Mommy." The words felt like a physical blow to Helen's ribs. "I know, baby, I know, but we can't, not right now." "Because of the bad men?" Chloe finally looked up, her eyes, usually so bright and full of innocent mischief, were shadowed with a sudden, tragic maturity. "Because you're a ghost?" Helen gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. "I'm your mother, Chloe. Above everything else, I am your mother, and my only job right now is to keep you safe. The men who came to the school, they want something that is locked inside my head. A secret. Why don't you just give it to them so they leave us alone?" It was a child's logic, beautifully simple, and dangerously naive. "Because if I give it to them, a lot of innocent people will get hurt," Helen explained, her voice steady but laced with a profound sadness. "And they wouldn't let us go anyway. In my old world, Chloe, leaving loose ends is a mistake bad men don't make." She didn't wait for a response. She couldn't afford the distraction. The GPS on her burner phone chirped a low, single tone. They were approaching the coordinates. The destination was an abandoned shipping yard on the industrial edge of Baltimore. Overlooking the murky, polluted waters of the Patapsco River, towering, rusted cranes loomed in the fog like skeletal giants. The air smelled of salt, decaying kelp, and diesel fuel. Helen pulled the Volvo into a cavernous, empty warehouse, the tires crunching loudly over broken glass and discarded shell casings. She killed the engine. The sudden silence, save for the rain drumming on the tin roof, was deafening. "Stay in the car. Keep your head down," Helen ordered. Unbuckling her seatbelt, she drew the Glock 19 from the small of her back, holding it low against her thigh. She stepped out into the damp, freezing air. The shadows seemed to breathe. "Marcus," Helen called out, her voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. "It's Parker. The oven is hot." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, a blinding, high-lumen tactical spotlight snapped on from the catwalk 30 feet above, pinning Helen in a circle of stark white light. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise a hand to shield her eyes. "Drop the mag, clear the chamber, and place the weapon on the hood of the car." A voice echoed through a megaphone. It was Marcus, still paranoid, still theatrical. Helen sighed, expertly ejecting the magazine and catching it in her palm. She racked the slide, catching the live round as it ejected, and placed the gun and the ammo on the hood of the Volvo. The spotlight clicked off. Heavy, uneven footsteps clanged down a metal staircase. Marcus emerged from the shadows. He looked exactly as he had 3 years ago, just slightly more weathered. He was a mountain of a man, an ex-NSA cryptographer who had gone completely rogue after a moral crisis in 18. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, a beanie pulled low over his dreadlocks, and a customized AR-15 slung casually across his chest. He stopped 10 feet away, holding a handheld RF scanner. He swept it over Helen, then pointed it at the car. The scanner beeped a steady, clear tone. "Clean." Marcus lowered the scanner, his hardened eyes softening just a fraction as he looked at Helen. "You look like hell, Captain. Motherhood is exhausting." "Marcus," Helen replied, not missing a beat, "and apparently, So is being hunted by my therapist. Marcus let out a dry, rasping chuckle. I read your file when they officially buried you. Honorable discharge. PTSD. I thought you were baking cupcakes in the suburbs. I was. Until this morning. Helen gestured to the car. I have my daughter in there. Marcus. She's cold. She's terrified. And she's hungry. Are we going to stand out here comparing scars? Or are you going to let us into the bunker? Marcus's eyes shifted to the dark windows of the Volvo. His demeanor instantly changed from a wary operative to a reluctant host. He nodded once. Bring her inside. We have to move fast. If they found you in Alexandria, they'll be sweeping the grid for your digital footprint soon. Helen retrieved her weapon and opened the back door. She lifted Chloe out of the car. The little girl buried her face in Helen's neck, trembling violently. Marcus led them behind a stack of rotting shipping crates, pulling back a heavy, electrified tarp to reveal a reinforced steel door built directly into the concrete foundation of the warehouse. He punched in a 12-digit code, and the door hissed open with pneumatic force. Inside, it was a different world. A state-of-the-art server farm hummed with life. Banks of monitors glowed with streams of code, satellite imagery, and dark web forums. The air was dry and smelled of ozone and cheap coffee. Sit her on the cot. Marcus pointed to a small bed in the corner. He tossed Helen a foil-wrapped protein bar and a bottle of water. Eat. Helen handed the food to Chloe, kissing the top of her head before turning back to Marcus. The maternal warmth vanished, replaced by the icy efficiency of the sad operative. Talk to me about Manticore, Helen said, stepping up to the main console. Marcus stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the backlit keyboard. He looked at Helen, his expression grave. When you called and said that word, I thought my comms were hallucinating. Manticore was a ghost story. Helen, a boogeyman the Kremlin whispered about to keep their cyber division awake at night. It's not a ghost story, Helen said flatly. 3 years ago in Geneva, my team intercepted a Russian courier. We took heavy fire. My team didn't make it. I stripped the data from the courier's drive, memorized the sequence, and destroyed the hardware before I was medevaced out. The agency wiped my memory of the op to protect me. Or so I thought. They didn't wipe it, Marcus corrected, pulling up a deeply encrypted file on his center screen. They buried it, and someone just brought a shovel. This therapist of yours, Vance? Dr. Julian Vance, operating out of Georgetown. Marcus's fingers flew across the keyboard. Facial recognition software began scanning databases. He's not Russian intelligence, Helen, and he's not CIA. A photo popped up on the screen. It was Vance, but younger, wearing a tailored military uniform that bore no insignias. His real name is Arthur Sterling, Marcus said, the color draining from his face. He's an independent contractor. He works for the highest bidder. And right now, the highest bidder is a shadow syndicate known only as the Vanguard. What do they want with a power grid code? Helen asked, her brow furrowing. Marcus slowly turned his chair to face her. That's the problem, Helen. You were lied to. Manticore isn't a power grid code. Helen froze. What? I've been tracking the dark web chatter since your call. The Manticore sequence is a backdoor. A master key, Marcus explained, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. It doesn't shut down power grids. Helen, it overrides the launch protocols for the United States autonomous drone fleet. The entire fleet. If Sterling extracts those numbers from your head, The Vanguard won't just black out a city. They'll have their own private, untraceable air force. Helen felt the blood drain from her face. The weight of the world suddenly crashed down onto her shoulders. Before she could process the horrific revelation, an alarm blared through the bunker. A harsh, red light began flashing violently. "Marcus, what is that?" Helen yelled over the siren, drawing her weapon instinctively. Chloe screamed, covering her ears. Marcus was furiously typing, staring at the security feed from the perimeter of the shipping yard. "It's a proximity breach. Heat signatures. 4. No. 8 of them. Coming in from the river." He looked up at Helen, stark terror in his eyes. "They didn't track you, Helen," Marcus said, racking the bolt of his AR-15. "They tracked me." The bunker's red perimeter alarms bathed the server room in a rhythmic, violent crimson light. The deafening wail of the siren made the concrete floor vibrate. "Cut the noise, Marcus, now," Helen barked, her voice slicing through the chaos with absolute military authority. Marcus slammed a massive fist down on a glowing yellow button on his console. The siren died instantly, leaving behind a ringing, suffocating silence. Only the soft hum of the servers and the frantic, shallow breathing of an 8-year-old girl remained. "They're cutting through the outer steel doors with a thermal lance," Marcus said, his eyes glued to a secondary monitor. "We have maybe 60 seconds before they breach the airlock." Helen didn't waste a millisecond panicking. Her mind compartmentalized the terror, locking it away. She was Captain Parker again. She holstered her Glock 19 and unzipped her black canvas go bag. Pulling out 2 tactical flashbang grenades and an extra magazine, she shoved the spare mag into her back pocket and grabbed a heavy Kevlar vest from a hook on the wall. "Chloe, look at me." Helen knelt in front of her daughter, her hands firmly gripping the little girl's trembling shoulders. "We are playing shadows on the hardest level right now. Do you see that metal grate under Marcus's desk?" Chloe nodded, her eyes wide, tears spilling silently over her cheeks. "I need you to crawl in there. I need you to pull your knees to your chest. Cover your ears. And close your eyes. No matter what you hear. No matter what happens. You do not come out until I say your middle name. Do you understand?" "Marie," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "My middle name is Marie." "That's right, my brave girl. Now go. Hide." Helen watched her daughter scramble beneath the heavy steel desk, curling into a tiny, invisible ball behind a wall of tangled Ethernet cables. Helen swallowed the lump in her throat and turned back to Marcus. "What's the exit strategy?" Helen asked, jacking around into the chamber of her Glock. "Blowout panel at the back of the server farm," Marcus replied, hoisting his customized AR-15. "Leads to an old drainage pipe that dumps right into the Patapsco River. I have a Zodiac inflatable stashed in the culvert. But we have to cross 30 yards of open floor to get to the panel. Then we make them blind," Helen said. She looked up at the ceiling, tracing the path of the overhead fluorescent lights. "Kill the main breaker. Give me night vision if you have it." Marcus tossed her a pair of matte black tactical goggles from a drawer. "Just like Geneva, Captain. Just like Geneva. Only this time, we don't leave anyone behind." Helen strapped the goggles over her head and pulled them down. The world shifted into a crisp, high-contrast spectrum of emerald green. Marcus slammed the master switch. The bunker plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. 10 seconds later, the heavy pneumatic hiss of the airlock door failing echoed through the cavernous space. Then, the distinct clack-clack of suppressed automatic weapons entering the room. Helen crouched behind a towering rack of servers, her breathing perfectly controlled. Through her night vision goggles, she watched them fan out. 8 men, advanced tactical gear, suppressed submachine guns, and unfortunately for them, they were using white light flashlights attached to their barrels instead of night vision. They expected a terrified hacker, not a ghost from the Special Activities Division. Spread out, find the girl, find the woman, kill the tech, a voice commanded in a hushed, Russian-accented growl. The vanguard had deep pockets. Helen moved. She didn't walk, she flowed. She slipped between the server racks with the silent, lethal grace of a hunting panther. She flanked the 2 men moving down the left aisle. She waited until the first man stepped past a cooling vent, the hum of the fan masking her movement. Helen lunged from the shadows. She grabbed the back of his tactical vest, sweeping his legs out from under him, and brought the heavy steel butt of her Glock crashing down on his temple before he even hit the ground. He went limp instantly. The second man whipped around at the sound of the scuffle, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. Pew, pew. Helen fired 2 suppressed rounds center mass. The man dropped, his armor absorbing the impact. But the kinetic force knocked the wind out of him. Before he could raise his weapon, Helen stepped on his wrist, pinning his gun to the floor, and delivered a brutal, precise kick to his jaw. Lights out. 2 down, 6 to go. Contact left. One of the mercenaries yelled, opening fire. The silence of the bunker was shattered by the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. Sparks rained down as bullets chewed through the aluminum server racks, severing wires and showering the room in a cascade of electrical pops. Marcus! Suppressive fire! Helen yelled over the din, diving into a comms trench cut into the concrete floor. Marcus roared, popping up from behind his reinforced console and unloading a blistering volley of 5.56 rounds from his AR-15. The thunderous noise of the unsuppressed rifle in the enclosed concrete space was staggering. The mercenaries scrambled for cover, their flashlight beams swinging wildly. Moving to the panel, Marcus shouted, abandoning his console and sprinting toward the back wall. Helen provided cover, snapping out of the trench and dropping a third mercenary who tried to flank Marcus. "Mommy!" The scream cut through the gunfire like a knife. Helen's blood ran cold. She whipped her head around. One of the mercenaries had flanked the main desk. He was shining his flashlight beneath the console. He had found Chloe. Target acquired. "I have the child," the mercenary called out, reaching down to grab the screaming 8-year-old. Helen didn't think. The maternal instinct overrode every tactical protocol she had ever learned. She sprinted directly across the open floor, completely exposing herself to the crossfire. Bullets zipped past her ears like angry hornets. One grazed the thick fabric of her jacket, burning a line across her shoulder. She didn't stop. She pulled the pin on her flashbang grenade and hurled it directly at the feet of the mercenary reaching for her daughter. "Cover your eyes," Helen screamed. She slid on her knees across the smooth concrete just as the grenade detonated with a blinding, agonizing flash of white light and a concussive boom that sucked the oxygen from the room. The mercenary screamed, dropping his weapon and clawing at his blinded eyes. Helen didn't hesitate. She closed the distance, grabbed him by the tactical rig, and slammed him headfirst into the solid steel frame of the desk. She slid under the desk, grabbing at terrified, sobbing Chloe. "I've got you. I'm here," Helen yelled, her ears ringing violently from the blast. She hoisted Chloe into her arms, holding her tight against her Kevlar vest. "Helen, the panel is primed," Marcus shouted from the far wall. He was holding a remote detonator. He had taken a bullet to the thigh and was bleeding heavily, leaning against the concrete wall for support. "Blow it," Helen screamed, running toward him with Chloe in her arms, firing blindly behind her to keep the remaining mercenaries pinned down. Marcus pressed the detonator. The back wall of the bunker exploded outward in a shower of brick, mortar, and dust. The cold, putrid night air of the Patapsco River flooded in, along with the deafening sound of the rain. Helen reached Marcus. She slung his heavy arm over her uninjured shoulder, bearing half his weight. "Come on, big guy, we're leaving," she grunted. Together, the three of them stumbled through the jagged, smoking hole in the wall and slid down a muddy embankment into the pitch-black mouth of the drainage pipe. Behind them, the bunker burned, casting long, flickering shadows on the water. They had survived the breach. But as Helen loaded her crying daughter and bleeding friend into the cold rubber of the Zodiac boat, she knew the terrifying truth. The Vanguard knew who she was. They knew about Chloe. They knew about Manticore. Running was no longer an option. If she wanted her daughter to live, Captain Helen Parker was going to have to burn the Vanguard to the ground. The Patapsco River was a ribbon of freezing, black ink slicing through the industrial heart of Baltimore. The only sound was the low, muffled hum of the Zodiac's electric outboard motor and the relentless, driving rain slapping against the rubber hull. Helen knelt at the stern, her hand steady on the tiller, her night vision goggles pushed up onto her forehead. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the bunker was beginning to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep ache and the sharp, burning sting of the bullet graze on her shoulder. But she couldn't afford to feel it. Not yet. In the center of the small raft, Marcus lay slumped against the pontoons. His breathing was a wet, ragged rasp. He had tied a makeshift tourniquet around his thick thigh using a nylon strap from one of the go bags. But the dark, glossy stain of arterial blood was still spreading across the wet canvas of his pants. Huddled beside him, tucked beneath a foil emergency blanket, was Chloe. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered, a terrifying, hollow sound in the dead of night. She hadn't cried since they hit the water. The shock had settled in, wrapping the 8-year-old in a numb, protective shell. "How are we doing, big guy?" Helen asked, keeping her voice low, her eyes scanning the dark, decaying piers passing by on their left. "I've had better Tuesdays," Marcus grunted, his head lolling slightly to the side. "Bullet went clean through, I think. Missed the artery by a fraction. But it nicked a vein. I'm leaking, Helen. Just hold on, we're almost there." Helen killed the motor as they approached the rusted pylons of an abandoned railroad bridge. The river current carried them silently into the pitch-black shadows beneath the massive concrete arches. She grabbed a mooring line and expertly looped it around a submerged iron rung, tying off the Zodiac. "Chloe, Bug, look at me," Helen whispered, stepping over Marcus to reach her daughter. She brushed the soaking wet hair out of Chloe's face. The little girl's skin was ice cold. "We have to walk a little bit now. Can you be brave for just a few more minutes?" Chloe gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Her blank stare shattered Helen's heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. She was dragging her innocent child into the abyss. Helen hoisted Marcus up, bearing the brunt of his 240-pound frame. He suppressed a groan of agony as his injured leg took weight. With her free hand, Helen grabbed Chloe. Together, the three of them dragged themselves out of the freezing water and up a slick, muddy embankment hidden behind a wall of overgrown river reeds. At the top of the embankment sat a crumbling brick warehouse that had once been a meatpacking plant. It looked utterly derelict, windows boarded up, graffiti covering the walls, and the stench of decay hanging heavy in the air. Helen practically carried Marcus to a heavy, rusted steel door in the alleyway. She didn't knock. There was a rhythm to this world. She kicked the base of the door twice, paused for 3 seconds, and kicked it once more. Hard. A moment later, a heavy iron peephole slid open with a screech. A pair of tired, bloodshot eyes peered out. "We're closed," a raspy voice muttered. "Elias, it's Parker," Helen gasped, adjusting her grip on Marcus. "The oven is cold, but my friend is bleeding out. Open the damn door before I blow the hinges." The peephole slammed shut. 3 heavy deadbolts clicked in rapid succession. The door swung inward, revealing a stark, brilliantly lit hallway that smelled sharply of bleach and iodine, a jarring contrast to the decaying exterior. Standing in the doorway was Elias Thorne, once a brilliant trauma surgeon for the military. Elias had lost his medical license a decade ago after getting caught smuggling combat stimulants. Now, he was the premier fixer for ghosts, mercenaries, and anyone who needed a bullet removed without a police report. He wore a stained surgical apron over a faded vintage band T-shirt, a cigarette dangling precariously from his lips. He took one look at Helen, then at the massive, bleeding man leaning on her, and finally at the shivering, traumatized child clutching her leg. Elias sighed, tossing his cigarette onto the concrete and crushing it beneath his boot. "Treatment room 2. Get him on the table," Elias ordered, his lazy demeanor instantly replaced by surgical precision. He helped Helen drag Marcus down the sterile corridor and hoisted him onto a stainless steel operating table. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Marcus looked terrible. His skin was the color of dirty ash, his lips tinged with blue. "Chloe, sit right there on that chair. Do not move," Helen commanded gently, pointing to a plastic waiting chair in the corner of the room. She wrapped the foil blanket tighter around her daughter. Elias was already at work. He grabbed a pair of heavy trauma shears and ruthlessly cut away Marcus's blood-soaked pants. He examined the wound with clinical detachment. "Through and through. Messy exit wound. You're lucky you've got thick thighs. Giant. Missed the femoral by a millimeter," Elias muttered, filling a syringe with clear liquid. "I'm pushing morphine and a broad-spectrum antibiotic. Then I'm packing it. You're going to be off your feet for a week. Minimum." "I don't have a week, Doc," Marcus slurred, his eyes heavy. "You do now, unless you want to die of sepsis in an alley," Elias shot back, plunging the needle into Marcus's arm. He turned to Helen. "And you're bleeding too. Shoulder." "It's just a graze. I'll glue it myself." Helen dismissed it, pacing the floor like a caged tiger. The adrenaline was being replaced by a cold, calculating fury. "Elias, I need a secure line. Burner network. And I need a favor. The biggest favor I will ever ask you." Elias paused his work, glancing from Helen to the shivering little girl in the corner. He had known Helen Parker for a long time. He had stitched her up after Geneva. He knew the ice in her veins. But he had never seen her look like this, desperate. Terrifying. And fiercely maternal all at once. What do you need, Parker? Helen stopped pacing. She looked at Chloe. The decision she was about to make felt like tearing out her own soul. But it was the only mathematical equation that ended with her daughter surviving. They know who I am. A syndicate called the Vanguard. They sent an 8-man sweep team after us. They want a biometric code locked in my head, Helen said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper so Chloe wouldn't hear. If I run, they will hunt us until we are dead. They will use her to get to me. Elias wiped his bloody hands on a towel. So what's the play? I stop running. I become the hunter, Helen stated, her eyes burning with a dangerous, lethal light. I'm going to find Arthur Sterling, the man who set this up, and I am going to rip the Vanguard out by the roots. That's suicide, Helen. It's an entire syndicate. It's war, she corrected him, and I know how to fight a war. But I can't do it with her in the crossfire. Helen took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to blur her vision. She walked over to the corner and knelt in front of her daughter. She took Chloe's freezing hands in hers. Chloe, honey, look at mommy. Chloe slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes were red and swollen. I need you to stay here with Dr. Elias and Uncle Marcus for a little while, Helen said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. It's a safe place. Nobody can find you here. Panic instantly flared in Chloe's eyes. She grabbed the collar of Helen's wet sweater, her little knuckles turning white. No, mommy, please, don't leave me. I'll be quiet. I'll play shadows perfectly. Please let me come with you. The child's desperate pleas echoed off the sterile tile walls, cutting deeper than any bullet ever could. A single tear escaped Helen's eye, tracking through the dirt and gunpowder residue on her cheek. I know, baby. I know you're scared, Helen choked out, pulling Chloe into a fierce, desperate embrace. She buried her face in her daughter's wet hair, breathing in the scent of her. But the men who are looking for us, they won't stop. I have to go make them stop. I have to go build a wall so high that no monster can ever reach you again. You promised. Chloe sobbed into her mother's shoulder. You promised you wouldn't do the dangerous job anymore. I lied, Helen whispered, the agonizing truth tearing from her throat. And I am so sorry. But this is the last time. I swear on my life. Chloe, this is the last time. Helen gently pulled back, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out the silver key to the Volvo's lockbox and pressed it into Chloe's palm, folding the little fingers over it. You keep this safe for me. It's a promise key. It means I am coming back for it. And I am coming back for you. Helen stood up, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. The mother was gone. The operator remained. She turned to Elias. Lock the doors. If anyone but me comes down that alley, burn them. Without looking back, Captain Helen Parker walked out of the treatment room, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind her, plunging her back into the dark, bloody waters of her past. The hunt for Arthur Sterling had begun. The rain had turned into a freezing drizzle by the time Helen made it back into the heart of Washington, D.C. She was a ghost navigating a city of monuments and sleeping politicians. She had swapped her blood-stained sweater for a sleek, black tactical jacket she'd kept in the go-bag, her honey blonde hair tied back into a severe, unforgiving knot. The graze on her shoulder burned with every movement, sealed shut with medical superglue she had applied in the back of a stolen Honda Civic. Pain was just data. She logged it and ignored it. Georgetown at 3 a.m. was dead quiet. The high-end medical plaza where Dr. Julian Vance had spent 6 months mapping the architecture of her mind stood like a monolithic tomb against the gray night sky. Helen parked the stolen Civic 3 blocks away. She didn't approach the front entrance. If the Vanguard was as professional as Marcus claimed, the plaza would either be crawling with local police investigating the shootout in Alexandria, or, more likely, swept clean by Vanguard's own fixers. She opted for the blind spot, the loading dock at the rear of the building. Moving with liquid silence, Helen bypassed the electronic keypad on the service door using a customized magnetic cloner from her kit. The lock clicked, glowing a faint green. She slipped inside, drawing her Glock 19. The air in the service corridor smelled of industrial floor wax and recycled ozone. She took the fire stairs, climbing 4 flights in absolute darkness. Her night vision goggles off to avoid the telltale green glow reflecting in the stairwell mirrors. She counted her steps. 48, 49, 50. 4th floor. She pushed the fire door open just a fraction of an inch. The hallway was dark, except for a single beam of tactical white light sweeping back and forth inside the frosted glass doors of Suite 402. Vance's office. They're destroying the paper trail, Helen thought, a grim satisfaction settling into her chest. Which means they haven't finished yet. Helen slid through the hallway, pressing her back against the cool, painted dry wall. She reached the door of Suite 402. It was unlocked, cracked slightly open to let the faint smell of melting plastic and burning paper drift out. The comforting scent of lavender and cedar was gone, replaced by the acrid stench of a professional burn job. She peered through the crack. A lone man in a black tactical turtleneck and dark slacks was standing over a shredder, feeding thick manila folders into the machine. On Vance's mahogany desk sat a heavy-duty thermite charge, unlit, ready to melt the hard drives into a puddle of slag once the physical files were gone. One cleaner. Arrogant. They assumed Helen was still running. Helen pushed the door open with her foot. It didn't squeak. She stepped onto the plush carpet, raising her weapon. "Put the files down." Slowly, Helen commanded, her voice a deadly, icy whisper that cut through the grinding noise of the shredder. The cleaner froze. He didn't raise his hands. Instead, his shoulders tensed, his right hand subtly drifting toward the holster at his hip. "Don't do the math. You won't beat the bullet," Helen warned, her finger applying a fraction of an ounce of pressure to the trigger. "Hands interlocked behind your head. Turn around." The man slowly complied, turning to face her. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized her. He was young, maybe late 20s, with the rigid posture of ex-military. "Captain Parker," he sneered, though a bead of sweat betrayed his bravado. "You're supposed to be floating down the Patapsco." "I swim well," Helen replied flatly. She closed the distance, pressing the hot suppressor of her Glock directly against his forehead. With her free hand, she reached into his jacket and relieved him of his sidearm, tossing it across the room. "Where is Arthur Sterling?" The cleaner laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You think you can stop this? Vanguard already has the infrastructure. Sterling doesn't need to coax the code out of you anymore. Parker, once we bring you in, he's going to carve it out of your cerebral cortex." Helen's stomach twisted, but her expression remained made of stone. "I asked you a location, not a prognosis." "Go to hell," the cleaner spat. He lunged forward, trying to slap her weapon away. It was a fast, Desperate move. But Helen had spent a decade anticipating desperate men. She pivoted, sidestepping his strike, and brought the butt of her gun crashing into the back of his knee. As he buckled, she wrapped her arm around his neck, applying a textbook blood choke. He thrashed for 5 seconds, his boots kicking against the mahogany desk. Before his eyes rolled back and he went completely limp, Helen lowered him silently to the floor, zip-tying his wrists and ankles with lightning speed. She was alone in the office. She had exactly 5 minutes before this cleaner missed a check-in. Helen holstered her weapon and moved to the desk. The thermite charge sat ominously on top of Vance's computer. She carefully moved it aside and booted up the machine. Password protected. Biometric lock. She dragged the unconscious cleaner over, pressing his thumb against the scanner. Access denied. Of course, Helen muttered. Sterling wouldn't give a low-level cleaner access to his primary files. He was a psychological architect. He built back doors into everything, including his own office. She stepped back, scanning the room with the eyes of an interrogator. What was out of place? The pendulum clock ticked rhythmically on the wall. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was the same clock Vance had used to anchor her during hypnosis. The focal point of her trauma. Helen walked over to the clock. It was heavy, made of solid oak. She reached behind it, running her fingers along the smooth wood. There, hidden in a recessed groove near the bottom hinge, was a tiny biometric scanner. It wasn't keyed to the cleaner. It wasn't keyed to Sterling. Helen took a deep breath. She pressed her own right thumb against the scanner. A small, green LED blinked. Click. The wall panel behind the clock popped open. Helen's breath hitched. Sterling hadn't just studied her, he had built his fail-safes around her. He knew she would come back here. He knew her exact psychological profile. Inside the hidden compartment was a single, black USB drive, and a thick, leather-bound journal. Helen grabbed both. She didn't have time to read the journal here, but she plugged the USB drive into the cleaner's decryption device he had left on the desk. Lines of code scrolled across the small screen, followed by a series of architectural blueprints. It was a facility, deep underground. Helen's eyes scanned the schematics. It wasn't a military base. It was an abandoned psychiatric hospital nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, near the West Virginia border. The blueprints showed soundproof interrogation rooms, surgical theaters, and a central chamber labeled the extraction rig. This was where Sterling was waiting. This was where he planned to break her mind apart piece by piece until the Manticore sequence spilled out. Suddenly, the encrypted radio on the cleaner's belt crackled to life. Echo 2. This is Control. Sitrep on the Georgetown burn. Over. Helen looked at the unconscious man on the floor, then at the thermite charge on the desk. She grabbed the unlit flare sitting next to the charge. She packed the USB drive, the journal, and the blueprints into her jacket. She walked over to the desk, struck the flare, and dropped it onto the thermite. The chemical compound ignited with a blinding, searing white light, burning at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It immediately began melting through the hard drives, the desk, and the floorboards beneath it, filling the room with thick, toxic smoke. Helen picked up the cleaner's radio and pressed the transmit button. Control, this is Captain Helen Parker, she said, her voice eerily calm against the roar of the thermite fire. Tell Arthur Sterling I have his address. And tell him to leave the front door open. I'm coming for him. She dropped the radio onto the burning desk and walked out of the office. The glow of the fire casting long, demonic shadows against the hallway walls. The mother who baked cookies in Alexandria was officially dead. The ghost of Geneva was back. And she was bringing hell with her. Deep in the jagged spine of the Appalachian Mountains, 300 miles from the burning wreckage of Georgetown, the Blackwood Psychiatric Facility sat like a concrete scar against the earth. Abandoned by the state in the late 90s, it had been purchased through a labyrinth of shell companies by the Vanguard. To the outside world, it was a decaying relic of a forgotten era. But 5 stories underground, past reinforced steel blast doors and biometric checkpoints, it was a state-of-the-art fortress. Arthur Sterling, no longer wearing the warm, comforting cardigans of Dr. Julian Vance, stood in the center of the primary interrogation theater. He wore a crisp, dark suit, his silver hair impeccably styled. He was carefully adjusting the leather restraints on a heavy, stainless steel medical chair bolted to the center of the room. Above the chair hung a halo of blinding surgical lights and a complex array of neural mapping sensors. They called it the extraction rig. The heavy steel door hissed open behind him. Commander Kozlov, the massive, battle-scarred Russian who led Vanguard's tactical division, stepped into the sterile room. Kozlov looked displeased. "Georgetown is gone," Kozlov rumbled, his thick accent echoing off the tile walls. "She bypassed the cleaner, used thermite on the primary drives. The suite is a total loss." Sterling didn't look up from the leather straps. He meticulously tightened a brass buckle. "And the cleaner?" "Alive, but zip-tied and concussed." Kozlov grunted, handing Sterling a charred tactical radio. "She left a message on our frequency. She said she has the address. She told you to leave the front door open." A slow, chilling smile spread across Sterling's face. He finally turned to look at the mercenary commander. There was no anger in his eyes. Only the terrifying thrill of a scientist watching his prize rat successfully navigate a maze. "She found the biometric trap behind the clock," Sterling murmured, genuinely impressed. "Fascinating. Her psychological profile is practically flawless. She doesn't retreat when cornered, she counterattacks." "You gave her our location," Kozlov growled, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "You invited a special activities operative into our stronghold. My men are sweeping the perimeter. But if she brings the agency down on us..." "She won't bring the agency." "Kozlov," Sterling interrupted, his voice returning to that smooth, hypnotic cadence. "She can't. If she goes to the CIA, they'll lock her in a black site to protect the Manticore sequence. And she will never see her daughter again. No, Helen Parker is coming alone. She is coming to kill me." Sterling patted the headrest of the metal chair. "Pull the perimeter guards back to the secondary tree line. Let her breach the outer fence. Draw her deep into the facility where the concrete kills radio signals. I want her exhausted, out of ammunition, and desperate by the time she reaches this room. The Vanguard wants that drone code, Kozlov, and I am going to peel it directly from her mind." 2 hours later, dawn was threatening to break over the misty peaks of the Appalachians. The air was razor cold, thick with the scent of damp pine needles and impending snow. Helen Parker parked the stolen Civic beneath the heavy canopy of a weeping willow. 2 miles out from the Blackwood facility's coordinates. She popped the trunk. It was time to shed the last remaining piece of the civilian she had been. She stripped off her civilian jacket and pulled on a lightweight, bullet-resistant tactical harness. She loaded her spare Glock magazines into the chest pouches. From the bottom of her go bag, she retrieved a customized, suppressed Mk-23 handgun, a heavy, offensive weapon designed for close-quarters elimination, and strapped it to her drop-leg holster. Finally, she slid a 6-inch, fixed-blade combat knife into the sheath on her collarbone. She was a walking armory, but the heaviest thing she carried was the burner phone in her pocket. Helen leaned against the cold bumper of the car and pulled the phone out. She punched in Elias's secure number. It rang once. "Thorne," Elias answered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "It's me," Helen whispered, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "Sit rep. The giant is stable. Fever broke an hour ago," Elias reported, the sound of a medical monitor beeping softly in the background. "He's going to live, assuming he stops trying to get off my operating table." Helen closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath of relief. "And Chloe?" There was a pause on the line. "She finally cried herself to sleep. I put her in the back room on a cot." "Helen." She held onto that silver key you gave her so tightly it cut into her palm. A tear slipped free, hot and stinging against Helen's freezing cheek. She aggressively wiped it away with the back of her tactical glove. "Elias, hold the phone near her. Please, just for a second." A rustle of fabric echoed through the speaker, followed by the soft, rhythmic sound of an 8-year-old taking deep, sleeping breaths. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of a future Helen was willing to die for. "I'm coming back for you. Bug." Helen swore silently in the dark. "I promise. Take care of her, Elias. If I don't check in within 12 hours, burn the clinic and get them out of the country using the passports in Marcus's bag. You make sure you check in. Parker." "Good hunting," Elias said softly, and the line went dead. Helen crushed the burner phone under the heel of her combat boot, grinding the microchip into the gravel. She was completely off the grid now. No backup, no extraction team. Just a mother and a mountain full of monsters. She turned and vanished into the fog-drenched woods, her eyes fixed on the monolithic silhouette of the Blackwood facility looming on the ridge. The spider was waiting in his web, but he had fundamentally misunderstood his prey. Helen Parker wasn't a fly. She was a hornet, and she was going to sting them until they were all dead. The Appalachian fog was thick enough to carve with a knife. It clung to the towering pines and rolled over the frost-covered earth like a heavy, gray ocean. Helen Parker moved through it without displacing a single branch. She didn't walk, she drifted. A phantom in Kevlar and cold steel. Through the emerald green lens of her night vision goggles, the Blackwood Psychiatric Facility materialized at the top of the ridge. It was a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of cracked brick and iron bars, strangled by decades of overgrowth. But Helen's eyes weren't on the decaying facade. She was looking for the thermal signatures of Kozlov's perimeter guards. She crept to the edge of the rusted chain-link fence, drawing her suppressed Mk-23. She waited, her breathing slowed to a glacial pace, merging with the ambient sounds of the mountain. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10. Nothing. The outer perimeter was completely abandoned. No patrols, no tripwires, no laser trip beams hidden in the brush. Helen lowered her weapon slightly, a cold knot of realization tightening in her stomach. It's too easy. A high-value Vanguard stronghold wouldn't leave its front yard unguarded unless they wanted someone to walk through the front door. Sterling was funneling her. He had pulled his men back, creating a vacuum designed to suck her deep into the subterranean levels where the concrete walls would neutralize her tactical advantages and block any chance of escape. He wanted her in a localized kill box. Helen crouched beneath the shadow of a massive oak tree, a grim smile touching the corners of her lips. Sterling was a brilliant architect of the mind, but he had never fought a war in the dirt. He didn't understand the fundamental rule of a siege: if they leave the gate open, you don't walk through it, you burn down the wall. She abandoned the direct approach toward the main building. Instead, she flanked west, following the thick bundle of heavy-duty, insulated power lines strung through the trees. An underground facility with climate-controlled server rooms and surgical suites required massive amounts of electricity. The grid couldn't support it alone, they had to have a localized substation. A quarter of a mile down the ridge, she found it. Hidden inside a concrete bunker masked by artificial camouflage netting was a dual diesel generator hub feeding directly into the facility's subterranean levels. Standing outside the bunker's steel door was a single Vanguard mercenary, smoking a cigarette to fight the biting cold, his thermal-scoped Scar-H rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. He was the only guard Kozlov hadn't pulled inside, the caretaker of their lifeblood. Helen holstered her handgun and drew the 6-inch fixed-blade combat knife from her collarbone sheath. She melted into the fog, circling around until she was directly downwind of him. The mercenary took a long drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange in the gloom. He exhaled a cloud of smoke, shivering. He never even heard the footsteps. Helen struck with terrifying, mathematical precision, her left hand clamped violently over his mouth and nose, snapping his head back against her tactical harness to prevent a helmet strike. Simultaneously, her right hand drove the combat knife upward, sliding seamlessly under the edge of his Kevlar vest and piercing his heart. The man convulsed once, his eyes wide with sudden, silent terror. Helen held him tight, feeling the rapid, fading thump of his pulse against her forearm. She lowered him gently to the frost-covered grass, leaving no blood spatter, making no sound. She retrieved his encrypted tactical radio, clipping it to her vest, and dragged his body behind the concrete wall. Helen approached the bunker door. It was secured by an electronic keypad. She didn't bother hacking it. She pulled a small, brick-like slab of C4 explosive from her chest pouch, molded it directly over the locking mechanism, and embedded a blasting cap. She stepped back behind the thick trunk of a pine tree, gripping the detonator. Time to turn out the lights, Doctor. Helen pressed the trigger. The explosion was a muffled, concussive thud that barely echoed over the ridge, but the steel door blew inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Helen swept into the room, her Mk-23 drawn, but the bunker was clear. The deafening roar of the twin diesel generators filled the space, pumping life down into Sterling's underground fortress. She moved to the primary control console. She didn't just shut the generators down, that would trigger their backup battery arrays. She needed to fry the system completely. Helen opened the main breaker box, exposing the thick, high-voltage copper wiring. She unclipped her heavy steel flashlight, wrapped the handle in thick rubber electrical tape from her pouch, and jammed it brutally across the positive and negative terminals. A blinding arc of blue electricity erupted from the box. The generators shrieked, a high-pitched, metallic squeal of overloading turbines, before dying with a violent, catastrophic crunch. Thick, black smoke began pouring from the exhaust vents. 5 stories below, in the pristine, brightly lit interrogation theater, the surgical halo above Arthur Sterling flickered wildly and died. The hum of the climate control ceased. The electronic locks on the blast doors failed. Defaulting to manual override, the state-of-the-art facility was instantly plunged into suffocating darkness. Lit only by the weak, red glow of emergency exit signs. On Helen's vest, the dead mercenary's radio hissed to life with a chorus of panicked Russian voices. Control, we have a catastrophic power failure. Main grid is fried. Backup arrays are unresponsive. Helen pressed the transmit button on her stolen radio. She adjusted her voice, letting the cold, calculating fury of Captain Parker bleed through the static. Arthur Sterling. Helen's voice echoed through the earpieces of every mercenary trapped in the dark below. You built a very nice cage. But you forgot one thing. In the pitch-black interrogation room, Sterling stood frozen, the leather restraints slipping from his hands. He stared up at the concrete ceiling, the smooth, arrogant facade cracking for the very first time. "What's that, Captain?" Sterling asked into Kozlov's radio, his voice tight. "You locked yourselves in here with me," Helen whispered, stepping out of the generator bunker and walking toward the dark, gaping maw of the hospital's service entrance. "I'll see you in the dark, Doctor." The descent into the Blackwood facility was a plunge into the abyss. With the main power severed, the heavy freight elevator was useless. Helen took the maintenance stairwell, a tight, spiraling concrete shaft that smelled of damp earth, rust, and decades of neglect. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic dripping of condensation and the ghostly hum of the stolen radio clipped to her harness. "Bravo team, hold position at intersection 4. Charlie team, sweep the hydrotherapy wing. Do not engage single-handed. She is sad. Treat her like a ghost." Kozlov's voice crackled through the earpiece, no longer barking orders with arrogant certainty. He sounded tense. He was bleeding control, and he knew it. Helen adjusted her night vision goggles. The world was bathed in a crisp, hyper-detailed emerald green. She reached the bottom of the stairwell. Level sub-2. The heavy fire door was electronically dead, its magnetic lock disengaged by the power grid failure. She eased it open, the rusted hinges offering only a whisper of resistance. She stepped into the hydrotherapy wing of the old asylum. The corridor was wide, lined with cracked, peeling ceramic tiles and rusted iron tubs that looked like ancient sarcophagi. The only illumination came from the weak, blood-red glow of the emergency exit signs stationed every 50 feet. To a normal human eye, it was a pitch-black labyrinth. To Helen, it was a perfectly lit shooting gallery. 4 sweeping beams of stark white light cut through the darkness at the far end of the hall. Charlie team, 4 men moving in a tight, diamond formation, their suppressed MP5 submachine guns tracking every shadow. They were heavily armored, their boots crunching loudly on broken glass. They were professional, but they were blind to everything outside their flashlight cones. Helen didn't draw her Mk-23. Gunfire, even suppressed, would give away her position too quickly. She needed to break their formation. She needed to introduce panic. She slid behind a massive, overturned hydrotherapy tub, picking up a heavy iron valve wheel that had rusted off the plumbing. She weighed it in her hand, calculating the distance and the acoustics of the tiled hallway. With a flick of her wrist, She hurled the iron wheel down a branching side corridor to her left. Clang! The sound echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence. All 4 flashlight beams instantly snapped toward the side corridor. Movement, left flank, the pointman shouted, his voice tight. Hold formation, sweep it together, the squad leader commanded. They pivoted, their backs turning to the overturned tub where Helen crouched. That was their first, and last, mistake. Helen surged from the shadows like a coiled spring releasing. She covered the 30 feet between them in less than 3 seconds. Her footsteps entirely masked by their heavy, panicked breathing. She hit the rearguard first. She didn't use the knife. She grabbed the back of his tactical helmet, yanked his head backward to expose the unarmored gap at his throat, and delivered a devastating, crushing strike with the rigid edge of her hand directly to his trachea. The man dropped like a stone, clutching his throat, unable to even scream to warn his team. Helen caught his falling MP5 by the sling, preventing it from clattering to the floor. She used his collapsing body as a springboard, launching herself at the mercenary to his right. She drew her combat knife in midair and drove it into the soft tissue right beneath his armpit, bypassing the Kevlar plates, and sinking the 6-inch blade deep into his lung. He gasped, a wet, choking sound, his flashlight beam dropping wildly to the floor. Contact, the squad leader finally screamed, spinning around. But Helen was already moving. She dropped the knife, leaving it in the falling man, and drew her Mk-23 handgun in a fluid, blindingly fast motion. Peefed, peefed. 2 suppressed rounds punched through the third mercenary's visor before he could even raise his weapon. The squad leader, panicked and disoriented by the strobing flashlights of his dying men, squeezed the trigger of his submachine gun. A hail of bullets chewed into the ceramic tiles, sparking wildly, but he was shooting at shadows. Helen had already dropped to a low crouch, sliding across the wet floor beneath his line of fire. She kicked his knee joint with enough force to shatter the cartilage. As the leader buckled with a scream of agony, Helen rose, pressing the hot suppressor of her Mk-23 directly under his chin. She didn't pull the trigger. She just held it there. The man froze, his breath hitching, the barrel of his own gun pointing uselessly at the ceiling. The red emergency light cast a demonic glow over Helen's face, her eyes hidden behind the glowing green lenses of her goggles. "Call it in," Helen whispered, her voice colder than the Appalachian wind outside. "Tell Kozlov the hydrotherapy wing is clear." The mercenary swallowed hard, trembling violently. He reached for the radio on his chest with a shaking hand. "See Charlie actual to control," he stammered, a tear of pure terror leaking from his eye. "Hydrotherapy it's clear. Nothing here." "Good boy," Helen breathed. She shifted her grip and brought the heavy steel frame of the handgun crashing down against his temple. The squad leader slumped into unconsciousness. Helen stood up, surrounded by the 4 incapacitated Vanguard operatives. The entire engagement had lasted less than 12 seconds. Her heart rate hadn't even spiked. She retrieved her combat knife, wiped the blade clean on a downed man's uniform, and sheathed it. She picked up 3 of their flashlights, leaving them switched on, and rolled them down the corridor in different directions to create a chaotic web of light and shadows. Then, she unclipped her stolen radio. "Kozlov," Helen said, pressing the transmit button. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "Charlie team is asleep. Send Bravo." I'm just getting warmed up. Silence hung on the frequency for a long, agonizing moment. You arrogant American bitch, Kozlov finally snarled, his composure completely shattered. You think you can hunt us? You are one woman. I have 30 men between you and the extraction rig. 30 men, Helen repeated, stepping over a body and moving deeper into the facility. Her eyes tracking the thermal heat signatures bleeding through the ceiling from level sub-3. That just means I don't have to aim carefully. See you soon, Commander. Helen clicked the radio off. The psychological warfare was working. Fear made professional soldiers sloppy. It made them clump together. It made them predictable. But as she reached the heavy steel blast doors leading to the subterranean elevator shaft, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. The raw survival instinct that had kept her alive in Geneva flared to life. She stopped. She looked closely at the edges of the blast door. There were tiny, almost microscopic scratches on the painted metal. Fresh scratches. Kozlov wasn't just sending men to die in the dark. He was a veteran of Chechnya. He knew how to fight a ghost. You don't chase a ghost, you bottleneck it. Helen slowly backed away from the door, aiming her night vision goggles at the ceiling above the entrance. Buried in the shadows, wired perfectly into the doorframe, were two directional claymore mines. If she had pushed that door open, 3 pounds of C4 and steel ball bearings would have vaporized her. Sterling might be the architect of the mind, but Kozlov was the architect of the kill zone, and he had just laid down the gauntlet. Helen lowered her weapon, a grim, terrifying resolve settling over her. The stealth portion of the evening was officially over. It was time to go loud. She reached into her go bag and pulled out the 2 remaining blocks of high-explosive C4. All right, Kozlov, Helen whispered to the dark. Let's remodel this place. Tram thay muk du han dong va tam li chien trong chuang ne the now? Con gia se rat thich tu ki thay Helen ha guk mo doi lind choyen niep de dang nu the now. Nung nga y lap tuk by ko li mat dat boy kai bei min claymore kua Kozlov, chung to k tu kua ko kung kong he ngu nok. Helen stepped back from the heavy steel blast doors, her night vision goggles scanning the surrounding architecture. Kozlov had rigged the door with claymores, expecting her to either hack the electronic lock or blow the hinges. It was a fatal funnel, a perfect kill zone. But Kozlov was thinking like a soldier fighting a conventional war in a hallway. Helen was thinking like a saboteur in a decaying ruin. She turned her attention to the wall 10 feet to the right of the door. The Blackwood facility was built in the 1950s. The concrete was thick, but decades of Appalachian moisture seeping through the bedrock had severely compromised the mortar. Through her thermal imaging, Helen could see the faint, structural cold spots where the rebar had rusted away. She molded the 2 blocks of C4 directly against the weakened masonry, burying the blasting caps deep into the explosive clay. She spooled out 20 feet of detonation wire, retreating behind the overturned hydrotherapy tub. She primed the detonator. Her thumb hovered over the trigger. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback erupted from the ceiling. Helen flinched, her finger freezing. The emergency public address system, powered by an isolated, hard-wired battery loop separate from the main grid, crackled to life. The sound echoed through the tiled corridors. A ghostly, metallic hiss. Breathe in through the nose. Helen, hold it. Release through the mouth. The voice was perfectly calm. Smooth. Warm and utterly terrifying. It was Arthur Sterling. Helen's heart slammed against her ribs. The conditioning was so deep, so meticulously planted over 6 months of therapy, that her body instinctively tried to follow his command. Her lungs expanded. She forced herself to exhale sharply, shaking off the hypnotic cadence. "I see you found Commander Kozlov's little surprise at the blast doors." Sterling's voice drifted from the rusted speakers, filling the darkness with an eerie, omniscient presence. "You're frustrated. The adrenaline is spiking. You want to destroy the obstacle. It's the same rage you felt in Geneva, isn't it? When the extraction chopper was delayed. When the fire started." Helen gripped the detonator so tightly her knuckles popped. He was using her trauma. He was weaponizing the very confessions she had wept over in his plush, lavender-scented office. "You told me you felt powerless, Helen," Sterling continued, his tone practically dripping with mock empathy. "You told me that watching your team burn was a failure you could never wash off. So you're overcompensating. You left your daughter in the hands of a disgraced pill pusher. And you came here to play the hero. But we both know the truth. You didn't come here to save Chloe. You came here because you belong in the war." "Shut up," Helen hissed through clenched teeth, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "There is a heavy oak door in your mind, Helen. We locked it together," Sterling murmured, "but right now, the lock is burning. The valley is on fire. Tick, tock, tick, tock." He was trying to trigger a flashback. He was trying to paralyze her with PTSD right before Kozlov's men closed in. Helen closed her eyes. She didn't see the fire of Geneva. She didn't see the mountains of Afghanistan. She saw a small, silver lockbox key pressed into the tiny, trembling hand of an 8-year-old girl. "I am coming back for you." Helen's eyes snapped open. The green hue of the night vision goggles cast her face in demonic resolve. She wasn't the broken veteran on the couch anymore. "My turn, Doctor," Helen whispered. She pressed the detonator. Boom. The confined space of the hydrotherapy wing magnified the explosion tenfold. A deafening shockwave ripped through the corridor, shattering the remaining ceramic tiles into a million jagged projectiles. The blast didn't touch the steel doors or the claymores. Instead, it completely obliterated the weakened concrete wall to the right, blowing a massive, jagged hole directly into the adjacent service tunnel. A thick, choking cloud of pulverized concrete and dust instantly flooded the air, blinding the thermal optics and choking the red emergency lights. Helen didn't wait for the dust to settle. She surged forward, diving through the smoking, jagged breach in the wall. On the other side of the blast doors, Bravo team had been stacked up in a tight defensive line, their heavy machine guns trained precisely on the doorway, waiting for Helen to walk into the claymore trap. Instead, the wall 30 feet to their left violently exploded inward. The concussive force knocked the closest mercenaries off their feet. The air was instantly filled with blinding gray dust. Coughing and disoriented, they swung their weapons wildly toward the breach. Helen was already among them. She emerged from the dust cloud like a nightmare. She didn't use the Mk-23. At this range, in this chaos, it was about speed and brutality. She grabbed the barrel of the nearest mercenary's M4 rifle, redirecting his panic fire into the ceiling, and drove her combat knife under his chin, up into his brainstem. She ripped the blade free as he collapsed, spinning seamlessly to face the next target. "Contact left. Flanked. We're flanked," a mercenary screamed, firing blindly into the dust. Helen dropped into a slide, taking his legs out from under him. As he hit the ground, she unholstered her Mk-23 and put 2 suppressed rounds through his Kevlar helmet. Peefed, peefed. The remaining 4 men of Bravo team broke formation, terror completely overriding their training. They were firing wildly, the muzzle flashes illuminating the thick dust like strobe lights in a charnel house. Helen used their own flashes to track them. She vaulted over a concrete barricade, landing behind a mercenary who was frantically trying to reload. She grabbed his combat harness, hoisted him backward, and used his armored body as a human shield just as his squad mate opened fire. The heavy 5.56 rounds tore into her human shield. Helen aimed her Mk-23 over his shoulder and fired 3 times. The shooter dropped, his weapon clattering across the floor. Only one left, the squad leader. He was backing away, his assault rifle raised, his breathing ragged and audible even over the ringing in Helen's ears. He was aiming at the dust, waiting for a shadow to move. Helen didn't move. She stood perfectly still behind the concrete pillar, letting the heavy dust cloud settle just enough. She unclipped an empty magazine from her vest and tossed it 10 feet to her right. It hit the floor with a metallic clack. The squad leader spun toward the sound, unleashing a deafening burst of automatic fire into the empty space. Helen stepped out from the left. She didn't shoot him. She raised her Mk-23 and fired a single round directly into the heavy, pressurized fire extinguisher mounted on the wall right next to his head. The canister ruptured with a violent explosion of compressed carbon dioxide, blasting the mercenary in the face with freezing white foam and concussive force. He screamed, dropping his rifle and clawing at his eyes. Helen walked up to him with terrifying calmness. She grabbed him by the tactical vest and slammed him against the wall. "Where is the extraction rig?" Helen demanded, the hot barrel of her gun pressing into his cheek. "Sub 5. The man sobbed, completely broken. "Bottom of the primary elevator shaft. Kozlov has the Alpha team guarding the shaft. You can't get past them." "Watch me," Helen said coldly. She struck him across the temple with the butt of her gun, letting him slide unconscious to the floor. Helen stood alone in the corridor. The dust was slowly clearing, revealing the bodies of Bravo team scattered around her. She ejected her half-empty magazine, caught it, and slid a fresh one into the Mk-23 with a sharp, satisfying click. The PA system crackled to life once more. "Bravo team is offline," Sterling's voice echoed, the mock empathy completely gone now, replaced by a cold, analytical fascination. "You truly are a marvel, Helen, but brute force won't save you. The Manticore sequence is a biological lock. If your heart rate elevates too high, if you sustain massive trauma, the memory pathways will scramble. You'll destroy the very thing you came to protect." Helen looked up at the rusted speaker on the ceiling. "I didn't come here to protect the code, Arthur," Helen said out loud, her voice steady and lethal. "I came here to kill the man who knows about it." She stepped over the rubble and headed toward the dark, gaping maw of the primary elevator shaft leading down to Sub 5. The final descent had begun. The primary elevator shaft of the Blackwood facility was a vertical abyss, peering over the edge of the forced open doors on level Sub 3. Helen looked down into a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the ambient light. The air smelled of heavy machine grease, oxidized iron, and the faint, bitter tang of copper. 80 feet below lay Sub-5. The extraction room. Through her night vision goggles, Helen could see the narrow, intersecting red beams of laser sights cutting through the gloom. Kozlov's Alpha team. They weren't sweeping the corridors, they were dug in on the maintenance gantries halfway down the shaft. Their heavy rifles pointed straight up. They were waiting for a shadow to rappel down the cables. If she tried to descend, she would be shredded by a crossfire before she made it 10 feet. Time is running out, Captain. Sterling's voice slithered through the stolen radio clip to her chest. The signal perfectly clear now that she was closer to the source. The facility's automated lockdown engages in 10 minutes. Once those blast doors seal on Sub-5, not even your C4 will open them. You'll be trapped in the dark with the ghosts. Helen ignored him. She looked up. Hanging silent and dead on level Sub-2, 20 feet above her, was the main freight elevator car. A 5,000-pound steel box, suspended by thick, braided titanium cables, locked in place by heavy emergency calipers when the power failed. Helen didn't need to rappel down. She needed an anvil. She holstered her Mk-23 and leapt across the open shaft. Grabbing the oily, secondary counterweight cable, her tactical gloves sparked against the braided steel as she hauled herself upward with brutal, burning efficiency, hand over hand, until she reached the bottom of the stalled elevator car. She climbed onto the roof of the car. The massive, hydraulic emergency brakes were clamped tight against the guide rails. Helen reached into her pouch. She was out of C4. But she still had the thermite flare she had taken from the Georgetown cleaner. She ignited the flare. The blinding, searing white light hissed to life. Burning at 4.000 degrees Fahrenheit. Helen jammed it directly into the primary hydraulic line of the braking mechanism and immediately dove flat against the roof. Wrapping her arms around the thick central suspension cable, the thermite melted through the steel casing in 3 seconds. Snap! The hydraulic pressure failed with a deafening, metallic shriek. The emergency calipers released. Gravity took over. The 5,000-pound elevator car plummeted down the shaft in absolute freefall. Helen rode the roof of the metal beast, her stomach dropping into her boots, the wind roaring past her ears like a jet engine. Below, the men of Alpha Team looked up, their laser sights tracing the falling monolith. They didn't have time to aim. They didn't even have time to scream. The massive steel car tore past the maintenance gantries, clipping the metal catwalks and ripping them from the concrete walls in a shower of sparks and pulverized rock. The sheer kinetic force of the falling box dragged a hurricane of debris down with it. Crash! The elevator slammed into the reinforced concrete buffers at the bottom of the shaft on level Sub-5. The impact was apocalyptic. The shockwave rattled Helen's teeth in her skull, throwing her violently against the suspension cable. The heavy steel roof buckled under her boots. Groaning in protest, a massive cloud of dust, grease, and shattered concrete billowed up the shaft. Alpha Team was gone, crushed or thrown into the abyss. Helen didn't wait for her vision to clear. Her ears were bleeding, a high-pitched ringing drowning out all other sound. But she moved. She dropped through the emergency escape hatch on the roof of the car and kicked the crumpled interior doors outward. She stepped onto level Sub-5. It was completely different from the decaying ruins above. Sub-5 was pristine. A backup generator, isolated from the main grid she had fried, bathed the corridor in a cold, sterile, LED white light. Helen ripped her night vision goggles off. letting her eyes adjust to the blinding brightness. She raised her Mk-23, sweeping the hallway. It was empty. The walls were lined with soundproofing foam. At the end of the corridor stood a set of heavy, bulletproof glass double doors. Beyond the glass was the extraction room. Standing in the center of the room, casually adjusting his cuffs, was Arthur Sterling. Beside him stood Commander Kozlov, a hulking mountain of a man gripping a fully automatic AUG-12 combat shotgun. His face a map of brutal scars. Helen walked down the corridor. Her tactical harness was covered in gray dust and dried blood. She looked less like a soldier and more like a force of nature, a reaper stepping out of the underworld. She reached the glass doors and kicked them open. Kozlov immediately raised the heavy shotgun, but Sterling held up a single, manicured hand. "Hold, Commander," Sterling said, his voice as smooth as aged bourbon. He looked at Helen, his eyes crinkling in that familiar, faux sympathetic smile he used to give her during their sessions. "Magnificent, Helen, truly. You bypassed a 30-man tactical defense using nothing but architecture and gravity. You are the apex predator. I told you to leave the door open." "Arthur," Helen rasped, raising her Mk-23 and aiming the tritium sights directly between Sterling's eyes. Her finger hovered on the trigger. There was zero hesitation in her stance. "The hunt is over." "Is it?" Sterling sighed, pacing slowly behind the heavy, stainless steel interrogation chair in the center of the room. The neural mapping halo above it hummed with predatory anticipation. "You see, Helen, you think this is a game of chess. You think because you crossed the board and cornered the king, you win. Step away from the chair." "Sterling, hands where I can see them," Helen commanded, her voice steady. "I am an architect, Helen," Sterling continued, completely ignoring the gun aimed at his head. "I don't play chess. I build the board. And I always lay a foundation you cannot see." Sterling reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, sleek tablet. He didn't look at it. He simply tapped the screen once and turned it around so Helen could see. Simultaneously, a massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall behind him flared to life. Helen's breath caught in her throat. The IC operator exterior cracked, shattering into a million pieces. It was a live thermal drone feed. The camera was hovering over a dark, rain-slicked alleyway in Baltimore. It was looking down at a crumbling brick warehouse. Elias's clinic. The thermal imaging showed 4 bright red human heat signatures stacked up in a tactical breach formation right outside the heavy steel door. "My Vanguard beta team has been in Baltimore for the last hour," Sterling said softly, watching the horror wash over Helen's face. "They tracked the burner phone you crushed in the woods. They triangulated your last call. Dr. Thorne's clinic is completely surrounded." "No," Helen whispered, the gun in her hand trembling for the first time in 3 years. "Your friend Marcus is heavily sedated on a surgical table. Thorne is unarmed. And little Chloe, she's sleeping in the back room, clutching a silver key," Sterling recounted, his voice dripping with sadistic precision. He tapped the tablet again. The audio feed cut in. Helen could hear the rain hitting the Baltimore pavement. She could hear the heavy, metallic clack of a Vanguard operative racking a breaching charge against Elias's door. "They are waiting for a single word from me, Helen," Sterling said. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by absolute, chilling authority. "If you pull that trigger, my heart monitor flatlines, and beta team breaches that clinic. They will kill Thorne. They will execute Marcus. And they will put Chloe in a black SUV. And you will never, ever see her again." The silence in the extraction room was deafening. The ringing in Helen's ears faded, replaced by the terrifying, rhythmic thud of her own heartbeat. "Checkmate. What do you want?" Helen choked out, a tear finally escaping her eye, cutting a clean line through the dust and gunpowder on her cheek. Sterling gestured gracefully toward the heavy leather restraints on the steel interrogation chair. "Put the gun on the floor, Captain Parker," Sterling commanded, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "Sit in the chair. Let me map your mind. Give me the Manticore sequence, and I will let your daughter live." Helen looked at the monitor. She looked at the 4 thermal signatures preparing to kick down the door separating them from her sleeping child. She looked at the cold, steel chair that promised to tear her sanity apart. Slowly, agonizingly, Captain Helen Parker lowered her weapon. The heavy Mk-23 slipped from Helen's fingers. It hit the pristine white tiles with a hollow, defeated clatter. Kozlov stepped forward instantly, his massive combat boot kicking the weapon across the room, far out of reach. Helen didn't look at the Russian commander. Her eyes were locked on the monitor. The thermal feed showed Vanguard's beta teams stacked against the door of Elias's clinic in Baltimore. One operative was raising a heavy breaching ram. "Smart girl," Sterling murmured, the tension leaving his shoulders. He gestured to the heavy stainless steel chair in the center of the room. "Have a seat, Captain. Let's finally unlock that door." Helen walked slowly toward the chair. Every step felt like walking to the gallows. She sat down, the cold steel biting through her tactical harness. Kozlov didn't hesitate, he moved in, securing the thick leather straps around her wrists, her ankles, and across her chest. He pulled them brutally tight, cutting off the circulation. Helen was entirely immobilized. Sterling stepped up to the control console. He pressed a sequence of buttons, and the heavy, metallic halo of the neural mapping rig descended from the ceiling, locking into place just inches above Helen's skull. A dozen tiny, cold sensor nodes pressed against her temples, her forehead, and the base of her neck. "I want you to know, Helen, I take no pleasure in this," Sterling said, his voice dropping back into the soothing, hypnotic cadence of Dr. Julian Vance. "It was sickening. You were my favorite patient. Your resilience is extraordinary, but progress requires sacrifice. Tell your men to stand down," Helen whispered, her voice tight with pain as the sensors calibrated, sending sharp spikes of electrical current into her scalp. "Call them off the clinic. Now. Once I have the sequence verified on my servers," Sterling replied, watching the biometric data flood across his dual monitors. "Close your eyes, Helen. Deep in through the nose. Hold it. Release through the mouth." Helen closed her eyes. "We are walking down the white hallway," Sterling droned, using the exact hypnotic triggers he had planted in her mind over the last 6 months. "We are at the heavy oak door. And right beside it is the black door. Operation Manticore. Open it, Helen. Show me the code." Behind her closed eyelids, Helen didn't see a door. She saw the burning wreckage in Geneva. She remembered the agonizing truth that Marcus hadn't known. The CIA hadn't erased her memory to protect her. They had locked the Manticore sequence inside her subconscious because a human brain was the only offline storage drive on the planet that couldn't be hacked remotely. But Manticore wasn't a master key to a drone fleet. That was a lie the agency fed to the dark web to bait syndicates like Vanguard. Manticore was a predator. It was a weaponized, polymorphic computer virus. A digital pathogen so aggressive it had to be kept isolated in biological tissue. And Sterling was about to plug it directly into the central nervous system of his entire syndicate. Her heart rate is dropping. Brainwaves entering theta state, Sterling announced, his voice vibrating with triumph. She's opening the door. The data is flowing. Kozlov, look at this. The architecture of the code is beautiful. On the monitors, a massive cascade of complex, encrypted alphanumeric sequences began pouring from the neural link into Vanguard's isolated mainframe. Call them off, Helen murmured, her voice sounding slurred, as if she were deeply hypnotized. Hold on, let the download complete, Sterling said, his eyes glued to the screen, completely captivated by the wealth of power flooding into his servers. 90%, 95, 100. We have it. Sterling smiled, reaching for his encrypted radio to give Beta Team the stand-down order. Suddenly, the lights in the extraction room flickered violently. A harsh, screeching alarm ripped through the sterile air. The biometric monitors surrounding Sterling's console flashed from a soothing blue to a blinding, violent crimson. Warning, critical overload, kernel panic. The automated voice of the mainframe echoed through the speakers. Sterling froze, his hand hovering over the radio. What? That's impossible. The mainframe is air-gapped. It's not a key, Arthur. Helen's voice was no longer slurred. It was razor-sharp, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Sterling whipped around to face her. Helen's eyes were wide open. They weren't the eyes of a broken patient. They were the eyes of the apex predator he had feared. What did you do? Sterling demanded, frantically typing on his keyboard. But the screens were melting into chaotic strings of corrupted code. You thought you were extracting a drone protocol, Helen said, a terrifying, blood-soaked smile spreading across her face. Manticore is a zero-day virus. Arthur, it's a digital bomb, and you just gave it the keys to your entire network. Shut it down, sever the connection, Sterling screamed at Kozlov. But the virus was already moving faster than human reflexes. On the large flat-screen monitor, the thermal feed of the Baltimore alleyway violently distorted into static. But just before the feed died entirely, Helen saw something beautiful. The heat signatures of Beta Team outside the clinic were suddenly blinded as their encrypted comms and tactical HUDs, all tied to the Vanguard mainframe, short-circuited. In that exact moment of confusion, a massive explosion rocked the alleyway. Marcus hadn't been asleep. He had rigged the clinic door. The thermal feed showed the breaching team being blown backward into the street just as the screen went black. Chloe is safe. The knowledge hit Helen like a shot of pure adrenaline. The extraction room descended into absolute madness. The neural halo began sparking uncontrollably as the virus overloaded the power regulators. Kill her, Sterling shrieked, backing away from the burning console. Kozlov roared, raising his AU-12 shotgun. But Helen had prepared for this the moment she sat down. She hadn't been clenching her fists in fear, she had been hyperextending her left thumb. With a sickening pop that would have made a normal person pass out. She dislocated her own thumb joint. Her hand slick with sweat and adrenaline. She yanked her left wrist free from the leather strap. Kozlov pulled the trigger. The heavy shotgun blast obliterated the headrest of the chair. But Helen was already moving. She threw her body to the right, using her free hand to unbuckle the chest harness. As Kozlov racked the shotgun for a second shot, Helen grabbed the heavy, sparking titanium arm of the neural halo above her. With a brutal surge of strength, she ripped the neural link arm from its ceiling mount and swung it like a baseball bat. The heavy metal, surging with high-voltage electricity, slammed directly into Kozlov's face. The massive Russian convulsed as thousands of volts surged through his skull. He crashed to the floor, his shotgun firing wildly into the ceiling, shattering the LED lights and plunging the room into strobing. Terrifying darkness, illuminated only by the sparks of dying servers. Helen ripped her remaining restraints off. She relocated her thumb with a sharp, agonizing twist against the armrest, swallowing the scream that tore at her throat. She stood up. The room was filling with acrid smoke from the burning hard drives. Through the haze, she saw Arthur Sterling scrambling toward the shattered glass doors, his pristine suit covered in soot, the architect fleeing his burning house. Helen reached down, picking up Kozlov's dropped AUG-12 combat shotgun from the floor. Its weight was a comforting anchor in the chaos. She racked the heavy bolt. The sound was a death knell in the smoky room. "Arthur!" Helen called out, her voice echoing over the dying wails of the Vanguard servers. Sterling froze at the doorway. He slowly turned around, his hands raised in trembling surrender. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, naked terror of a man who realized he had tried to cage a hurricane. Helen, wait," Sterling pleaded, stepping backward. "The code is destroyed. My network is gone. You've won. I can get you money. I can get you new identities for you and Chloe. Just let me walk away." Helen raised the heavy shotgun, leveling the barrel directly at his chest. The green glow of the emergency lights reflected in her cold, unforgiving eyes. "Our session is over, Doctor," Helen whispered. "Our session is over, Doctor," Helen whispered. Arthur Sterling raised a hand, opening his mouth to negotiate, to spin one last web of lies. But Helen Parker was entirely done listening to the architect of her nightmares. She pulled the trigger of the AUG-12. The heavy combat shotgun roared, a deafening thunderclap that shook the remaining glass in the door frames. The recoil punched into Helen's bruised shoulder. But she didn't flinch. Sterling was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force, crashing into the burning server racks before sliding lifelessly to the pristine white floor. Silence rushed back into the extraction room, save for the crackle of electrical fires and the dying, distorted groans of Vanguard's annihilated mainframe. Helen lowered the weapon. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel the adrenaline anymore. She just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. She unclipped the tactical harness, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud, leaving behind the armor of the ghost. She turned her back on the burning room and began the long climb out of the abyss. When Helen finally pushed open the heavy service doors of the Blackwood facility, the freezing Appalachian air hit her lungs like glass. It was dawn. The fog had broken, and a brilliant, piercing golden sunlight was bleeding over the jagged mountain ridges, setting the frost-covered pines on fire. Helen closed her eyes, turning her face toward the light. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't smell cordite or burning diesel. She just smelled pine needles and morning dew. The valley in her mind wasn't burning anymore. 2 hours later, the stolen, dust-covered Civic screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alleyway in Baltimore. The scene was a war zone. The brick walls of the meatpacking plant were scorched black. The twisted, smoking remains of a heavy breaching ram lay in the street. Surrounded by the tactical gear of Vanguard's beta team, local police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Helen threw the car door open and ran. Her legs felt like lead, her lungs burning, but panic propelled her forward. "Elias!" Helen screamed, her voice cracking as she reached the heavy steel door. It was blown off its hinges, hanging precariously by a single bolt. She practically fell into the brightly lit corridor. The smell of bleach and sulfur was suffocating. Standing in the center of the hallway, leaning heavily on a crutch with a bandaged thigh and a customized AR-15 still smoking in his hands, was Marcus. Beside him, Elias was calmly packing medical supplies into a black duffel bag. Marcus looked up, a tired, bloody grin breaking across his face. "Told you the oven was hot, Captain." Helen let out a breathless sob of relief. But her eyes were frantically scanning the room. "Where is she? Marcus, where?" "Mommy." The small, terrified voice came from the back recovery room. A tiny figure bolted out of the doorway, practically flying down the corridor. Helen dropped to her knees on the blood-stained tiles, opening her arms just in time to catch her daughter. Chloe slammed into her, wrapping her small arms around Helen's neck with a desperate, crushing grip. Helen buried her face in Chloe's messy hair, tears finally, mercifully, spilling over her cheeks in a warm, unstoppable flood. She pulled the little girl so tight it was as if she were trying to fuse them back into one person. "I'm here, Bug. I'm here. I've got you." Helen wept, rocking her back and forth on the hard floor. "You came back." Chloe sobbed into her mother's shoulder, her small frame trembling violently. She pulled back just enough to look at Helen's bruised, soot-covered face. Slowly, Chloe uncurled her fist, pressed into her palm, leaving a deep red indentation in her skin. Was the small silver lockbox key. "I kept it safe, just like you asked." Helen took the key, kissing her daughter's forehead over and over again. "You did perfectly, my brave girl. You won the game. The shadows are gone." Elias zipped up the duffel bag, tossing it over his shoulder. "Hate to break up the reunion, Parker, but the Baltimore PD is about 90 seconds away, and I don't have a license for the C4 Marcus just used on my front porch. We need to go, now." Helen wiped her eyes, a genuine, radiant smile breaking through the exhaustion. She stood up, lifting Chloe effortlessly into her arms. The weight of her daughter felt entirely different from the weight of the guns she had carried all night. It was the weight of a future. "Let's go home," Helen said. 3 months later, the warm breeze rolling off the Pacific Ocean carried the scent of salt and blooming hibiscus. On the wooden deck of a quiet, isolated beach house in Costa Rica, a woman sat in a rocking chair, a cup of dark coffee in her hands. Her honey blonde hair was loose, catching the golden hour light. There were no dark circles under her eyes. The haunted, hollow stare was gone. Down on the pristine white sand, a little girl with bright green eyes was furiously digging a moat around a massive sandcastle. "Mom, look, I made a drawbridge," Chloe yelled, waving a piece of driftwood. "It's beautiful, Bug. Make sure the walls are reinforced for the high tide," Helen called back, her laugh genuine and light. She took a sip of her coffee, leaning back in the chair. The trauma hadn't vanished completely, it never truly does. But it was no longer a cage. It was just a scar. and scars were proof of survival. Arthur Sterling was dead. The Vanguard network was erased from existence. Dr. Julian Vance's office was nothing but a charred memory. Helen reached into the pocket of her light linen cardigan and pulled out a sleek, untraceable satellite phone. It hadn't rung in 3 months. Suddenly, the screen illuminated. A single, encrypted text message popped up. Sender: M. Marcus. Message: the weather in DC is getting cold. A new storm is brewing. Do you need an umbrella? Helen read the message twice. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. The underworld never truly slept, and there would always be monsters trying to build cages for the innocent. But Helen Parker was done running. She typed a reply, her fingers moving with absolute certainty. Reply: let it rain. The ghost is retired, but if they come to my beach, I'll bury them in the sand. She hit send, powered the phone off, and tossed it onto the table. Helen stood up, walking down the wooden steps toward the ocean to help her daughter build a castle. The war was finally over, and the mother had won.